Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for being here. We'll get started. So thanks for joining us for the Reclaiming Native Spaces in Education and Politics panel. This is part of our Peace Studies conference happening all day today, which is focused on Native resilience. Later, you can join us so at 4 p.m. after this panel for a screening of the film Eagle and the Condor from Standing Rock with Love, which is a wonderful film I've seen a couple times. And then at 7:30 p.m., we'll have our keynote address by Winona LaDuke, and that will be happening actually in the Pellegrin Auditorium, which is in the Science Building on the other side of the Abbey. We also have the Why Treaties Matter exhibit going on at the Clemens Library at College of St. Benedict, and so you could check that out anytime between now and the end of September. I'd like to start this panel by acknowledging the land we gather on today is the original homeland of the Dakota and Anishinaabe peoples. I honor and respect the Indigenous peoples who were forcibly removed from and who are still connected to this territory. Centuries of genocide and forced assimilation have created a range of challenges for Indigenous peoples. I thank the participants of this panel for sharing their stories with us today. As we heard in our last panel, there are over 20 Native and Indigenous students at our schools from different nations. St. Ben's Monastery and St. John's Abbey used to operate boarding schools for Native children. Now, students, faculty, and staff are working to repair relationships with our Native Nation neighbors. So this conference is part of that effort. So I will now introduce the panelists in the order that they will speak. Our first speaker is Travis Zimmerman, a site manager for the Mille Lacs Museum and Trading Post and Indian Affairs liaison for the Minnesota Historical Society. He earned his Bachelor of Arts in History here at St. John's University in 1994. Travis is a member of the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. He is also a veteran of the U.S. Army and Minnesota National Guard. Travis has been involved with American Indian nonprofits in Minnesota for the last 20 years, serving as staff member and board member on numerous dozens of organizations. Welcome, Travis. Sorry, my instructions were I'll introduce all three of you, and then we'll have each of you come up in order and speak, and then we'll do Q&A. Thank you, though. Okay. Iye Kiapewe, Darlene St. Clair, is an associate professor and director of the Multicultural Resource Center at St. Cloud State University. She is a member of the Lower Sioux Indian community. She also leads the Native Studies Summer Workshop for Educators, which is designed to increase the knowledge, sensitivity, and awareness of Minnesota educators, administrators, and student service providers on the histories, cultures, and languages of federally recognized tribes and bands in Minnesota. Welcome, Darlene. Finally, Don Weddle has served some 45 years, or has worked for 45 years on American Indian issues. His work with the Mille Lacs, Ojibwe in Minnesota and Alaska tribes doing education, law enforcement, economic development, treaty rights, natural resources, and environmental protection has been significant. He has served as the Commissioner of Education, Commissioner of Natural Resources, and Chief of Police for the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe, to name just a few of his positions. He has also taught courses on tribal history and tribal government at Central Lakes Community Colleges in Minnesota and taught mathematics at the University of Fairbanks. He chaired the National Tribal Operations Committee for the Environmental Protection Agency and served on the EPA's Science and Technology Committee and Science Environmental Enforcement Committee. Welcome, Don. Okay, so we'll now hear 15-minute presentations from each of our panelists, and so if you could please hold your questions till the end, and then we'll have a big group discussion at that point. So Travis, now please come up, and we're happy that you're here. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Thanks for having me, and it's good to see a turnout like this, and I especially want to thank Ted Gordon for reaching out and inviting me to be part of this, and I think this is a great first step. A little bit about me. So I'm the site manager at the Mille Lacs Indian Museum and Trading Post. We're part of the Minnesota Historical Society. We've been a historic site since 1960. So we're going on 60 years here as a historic site. I'm a graduate of St. John's University, and when I went to school here, I never knew about the industrial school being here, the presentation that preceded this. And so I'm really happy that there's more going on, and trying to look at the history of St. John's and its relationship to Indigenous people, I think is great. I think this is a great start, and I look forward to more things happening here on campus. So I don't have a PowerPoint, and I just thought that I would talk more from personal experience about assimilation and overcoming assimilation through education, and some of what I've overcome and been involved with through the years. Education, happens a lot of different places. It doesn't just happen in a classroom. And so I grew up in Melrose, Minnesota here, about half an hour away. My brothers and sisters all went to St. John's or St. Ben's. And so I was always familiar with this campus. I kind of grew up on these two campuses as a kid. I was visiting my sister, visiting my brother as they went to school here. And so growing up in Melrose, Minnesota was interesting, to say the least, especially when I was a young kid. My dad, when I was about 5 years old, they were digging up the highway. I-94 was coming through. They were digging it up, and they found a bunch of artifacts. They found a bunch of arrowheads. And so they gave them to a guy in town that was involved with the kind of the history of Melrose, and was a local historian. And he knew that my dad was American Indian from Grand Portage, and so he gave him one of these arrowheads that they had found. And my dad gave it to me. I was the youngest of 4 kids. And he gave it to me when I was about 5 years old, and he said, "Never forget you're an Indian," right? And so I'm like, okay, cool, I got this nice arrowhead. But then it kind of made me, pause and think, what's an Indian? I was in Melrose. There was no Indians in Melrose. And so it really led to kind of a lifelong journey of me trying to find out what is an Indian and what does it mean to be an Indian. And so we had connections and family connections in Grand Portage, and we started, going. My dad was born on the reservation, but they moved off when he was very young, and he grew up in Two Harbors, Minnesota. But we started reconnecting with the reservation piece by piece, and so that kind of led me, on this journey of trying to find out, what it meant to be an American Indian. And so growing up, I graduated high school. I went in the military. I was served in the Army. I was in Fort Riley, Kansas for a couple years. And then I got out, came to school here at St. John's, and I was in the National Guards. And so I started thinking about this question, or this kind of overall theme about overcoming assimilation, and how do we do that, And then I thought, am I assimilated? I kind of check all the boxes, right? I graduated high school. I went to the military. I went to a good college. I now work for a institution like the Minnesota Historical Society. And so I started thinking, well, but then I started looking at my experiences within those. And, even when I was at St. John's here, I always made sure, and, looking at some of the comments from some of the interviews that were part of the last panel when they were talking to some of the students here, saying I didn't want to, some people didn't want to identify as being Native because it was just a lot put on them. They felt like they were, have to explain themselves, or had to deal with ignorance from other students and things like that. But I kind of already went through that in grade school and high school, because my dad said, "Don't forget you're an Indian." So I always let people know I was an Indian, and I physically fought for because I was an Indian. And I even remember there was, like I said, there wasn't many Indians growing up in Melrose, and there was this family that moved in town. He was a doctor, and they had adopted an Indian child, and so I got to know him. We didn't really become friends. He kind of was into computers at that time and things like that. We ran in different circles. I was constantly involved with sports and different things like that. But I do remember that he was always bullied in school. And I remember sticking up for him and fighting, and even fighting some of my friends because of it. And unfortunately, he committed suicide when we were in high school because he was bullied so bad. And so, I always knew I was Indian. I got ostracized for being Indian, but I didn't care. So when I got to college, I was a non-traditional student because I was a couple years older because had been in the military. I was married and had a child by that time. And so I was very comfortable in my identity and who I was. So I made sure that, that in the classes that I was in, that I made sure when we were talking about different issues and different things like that, that I tried to represent and tried to, bring that voice to the table about American Indians. I remember in one class in particular, in a government class, we were talking about the Middle East and how we identify terrorists and things like that. And I said, Indian people at one time would have been considered terrorists, because they were fighting. I look at them as freedom fighters, and so you always got to look at what slant and what perception are you coming from when you label people or when you talk about these type of things. And so I was also very fortunate about the thing I liked about St. John's is being a liberal arts college is that it seemed like no matter what class I took, I always find a way to interject American Indians into it. So I took a class on the American Revolution. Well, the paper I wrote was American Indians in the American Revolution. I took a class on the 60s for my history class. And so my paper was about the American Indian movement during the 60s. And so I always found a way, to bring that voice through in the classes that I attended, even if it wasn't part of the curriculum, it wasn't part of the syllabus. But through the work that I did and the research I did, I was able to bring this and bring that voice and bring that narrative to the classroom. So I was always very grateful for that. And then even when I was in the Army, thinking about this, did I assimilate because I went in the military? Well, to me, I didn't see it as I went in the military because I think America is the military might and wanted to go in there and fight for my country, so to speak. I never went in there with the intent to fight for my country, but my dad was in the military. All his brothers served in Vietnam. And so to me, it was a natural kind of progression. And it was also a way in the society that doesn't really honor warriors anymore. It was a way to be a warrior, right? Is for me to join the military. And so even within that though, when I was in the National Guards, I remember that we were going to be, they were going to send us to Guatemala, and it was called Project Timberwolf. And we were going to go down there and we were going to build roads. And because we were a transportation unit, the Red Bulls out of St. Cloud. And I had just heard Rigoberto Menchú speak at that time, Nobel Peace Prize winner, author, and about what was going on in Guatemala and how many indigenous people were being murdered with the help of U.S. forces. And so I started campaigning actively within my National Guards units that saying we shouldn't go. We shouldn't be a part of this because we're not just going there to build roads. We're going there to build roads then that is going to help the Guatemalan army kill Indian people. And I don't want to be any part of it. And so obviously I wasn't very popular, to say the least, to be standing up in, a military uniform telling people that we shouldn't go, and the reasons that we shouldn't go. And so even my work now, when I look at what I do with the Minnesota Historic Society, I hope I'm not there just to assimilate, and just tell the same old narrative and the same old story. And so that's one of the things that I've really tried to do working at the Mille Lacs Indian Museum. Obviously that is a native space. It's on a reservation, right on the Mille Lacs Reservation. It tells a native story. And so, I'm able to constantly use that space, not only tell the story of the Mille Lacs Band, but to, over the years, because we really don't change out exhibits that much. I've been able to invite Native artists to come and do shows there, right, and educate people about contemporary Native artwork. I've been able to have traveling exhibits like the Why Treaties Matter exhibit that's at Clemens Library now. We had it at the museum. And so I've been able to use that space, to help educate people and kind of not the same exhibits, but that have been there since the museum was opened up 20 years ago, by bringing in fresh perspectives and fresh material, and to constantly be able to use that as a tool to educate people about American Indians. Another thing we've done over the last couple of years is develop different programming for school kids. So we get a lot of school kids come up to our historic sites. It's a favorite place for field trips to come. And so over the years, we've been able to develop programming. And some of the programs that we've developed at the museum have been looking at, because most of the students we get visit are 2nd to 6th grade, so they're very young children. And one of the things we've been able to do is develop programs where we look at similarities. And to me, that's what's funny about the term assimilation, means to be the same as. We're already kind of the same, aren't we, in a lot of aspects, and we just don't seem to focus on it enough. And so that's one of the things we're trying to do there, is we're bringing in kids at a small age and not talking about how Indians are different than them, but how Indians are similar to them. So we've developed programs on music and dance, right? We develop programs on sports and games, on dolls and toys. These are universal themes that all kids grow up with, right? Everybody grows up with a household full of music or some kind of dance, or playing with some kind of toys, or playing games or sports, things like that. And so, that's how we've used that space to really, kind of look at assimilation and flip it on its head and say, hey, we're more common than we think. So, but my time's up.
Thank you, Travis. And our next speaker is Darlene St. Clair. I'll get your PowerPoint pulled up here.
Hamitakiapi, Hahanakinde chante washte na pechu zampie, ie kiapi we de mieye, washichu ia Darlene St. Clair e makiapie. Damakota chanshayapi hemataha wana chekpa untue adwati, wana ikche wichasha wanspe wichakia hemacha St. Cloud wanspe wakantia echdawani, petukinde, e chichiapi, Petukinde, Yuskia, Wanchiankapi. Hello, my relatives. Today I greet you with a good-hearted handshake. I'm Ie Kiapiwi, that's my name. My Washichu name is Darlene St. Clair. I'm Dakota. I'm from Chonshayapi, which is a place name in Minnesota. It translates to they paint the trees red. And that place is where the Lower Sioux community, the Lower Sioux Reservation is located. So I'm originally from Lower Sioux, but now I live in the Twin Cities, and I'm a teacher. I teach American Indian Studies at St. Cloud State University just down the road, and I want to say to all of you today, I'm happy to see you here. So I'm here to talk more about some projects that I've been working on and give some context for that work. So I'm very interested in thinking of education and the space of education, the institution of education, as a place for reclamation for indigenous thought and for Native peoples. And so just to sort of give some context, we have sort of a understanding of the ways that kind of the world works with reciprocity. So I just talked with my class about this today. So we talked a bit about, while individual actions are important in Dakota society, it is different than sort of the individualism that we witness in Euro and Euro-American society. So individual deeds are important, individual actions are important, but they're primarily important in the way that they make a contribution to the community. And we understand that, so for that reason, the individual depends on community for survival and for well-being. We understand that the community is dependent on nature for survival. So there is that aspect of that, the circle. We understand that nature is dependent on spirits or spiritual beings for nature's well-being. And then it comes back into fruition, comes back in full circle when we think about the ways that an individual, through prayer and ceremony, can sort of feed spirits. So within a Dakota worldview, relationality is really critical in understanding Dakota philosophy and the ways that we're oriented in the world. Certainly relationality comes through kinship and through not just our understanding of kin, but also the language used to describe kin. And we see that societies like Dakota societies will invest and develop complexity in aspects that are the most important. So in Dakota language, we have very complex terminology for kin terms. So mother and father and aunt and uncle and brother and sister. We have much more complexity than there is in English because that's an important part of our society. Whereas I would say that other aspects like days of the week are not important. Days of the week are not important. We didn't have names for days of the week in Dakota until first Europeans came here. And it was only when we first interacted with Europeans that they really insisted that we have days of the week. Why do you think that it's important that it was important for non-native people that we would have names for days of the week?
Pray on Sunday.
Yeah.
Thank you, Darlene. So now we have Don Weddle bear our final presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. So, Don, thanks for being with us.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, and thank Ted and Corin for everything. What I'm going to try to do today is give you a short overview of my experience in trying to understand various things dealing with education and assimilation and those types of things. And there are basically three things you need to look at if you want to really have some functional value for helping tribal people and dealing with tribal issues. And first, you need to try to understand the tribal culture. You need to understand the tribal history. And finally, you need to understand the tribal federal policy. And initially in '72, when I started working on tribal issues, a person came up who taught me how funding, how tribal governments, how all these things were working and what were the bases of them in U.S. law. And I thought, wow, what a waste of time. But that was actually the foundation I needed to be able to do practically everything that I did. And so that's really important to be able to look at that. And so what I'm going to try to do is give you a quick overview of what you might want to think about and how you might want to apply those things. The idea of culture, we all look at things in our society, in our families, and understanding that. And in tribal culture, a lot of times what you see is this interrelationship, which we were just talking about, how everything is interrelated, how things connect to each other. And I use this picture or painting as an example of that. So within tribal culture, there are things that, and we just talked about, that all things are related. And that's really something that's important to try to understand, and it's very difficult for non-tribal people to understand that concept. And the reason I believe that it's very hard to understand that concept is because if you look at the fundamental beliefs in non-tribal culture, in the generally referred to as white culture in the United States, it's the Bible. And the Bible has some fundamental values that get locked in. And the first thing you read is Genesis. And Genesis says, God gave man the power over the firmaments. So you have, as a human being, a God-given right to use the birds and the bees, the animals, all those things. You don't think about that. But underneath everything, there's that fundamental belief that God said it's okay. In the tribal belief, that doesn't exist. God did not say you had power over everything. You were part of everything. You were related to everything. What you did to one thing impacted other things. And today we're slowly grasping that idea. We call it ecology. But that's a fundamental belief that we have to really grasp when we're teaching, when we're trying to understand things, of that fundamental, where are we starting from and what does that mean? It's the understanding of that a lot of educational philosophy is based on. It's based on the idea in science that you can build on this, that you have the right to alter the river or change the land functions, to grow crops, to add things to crops. You have all these beliefs that this is all okay. And some of it is, but you have to understand it, that what you're doing, it's all related. It isn't independent of each other. And so when you're doing these things, you have to have that. And when tribal students become educated in the non-tribal system, they have to face that every day. Am I believing this from the standpoint of a tribal belief that this is all related, or am I accepting the principle that I have this right to do this over all of this? And depending on the student, depending on the issues, it can become very difficult and very frustrating and very complex. And I taught tribal students for years, and I saw that conflict grow, and I never understood it myself as to how that was all interacting and how that played out. So it's really important to try to grasp that fundamental position. And I use this photo, Eli Parker, as an example. He was a Seneca Indian, and he wrote the document that ended the Civil War. Think about that. He's a tribal person. He was a colonel in the Union Army, worked under General Grant, and he wrote the settlement to the Civil War. And he's a tribal person. Now, you could say he was assimilated. You can say all kinds of things. He was certainly educated, but he used that to do really good things. And I think it's important that we sometimes understand that in the tribal systems, there are all kinds of things going on. There are people doing all kinds of different things. Now I want to move to history. And in history, you have two histories going on. One is you have the tribal history going on, which are the things that the tribe has within its system, within its memory, within its all of the things around. And generally in the tribal system of history, certain families control certain amounts of history. Not all history is contained in one person. It's separate. And so you need to take care of each one of those families so that you can remember and understand the history of all those things. Then there's also the history that's written by tribal systems, by non-tribal systems, talking about what the history is. And we all kind of look at that and deal with that. Most of our education is written tribal histories that weren't written by tribes. It was written by somebody else. And that puts a gap into the way things are and where things are at. And an example of tribal history is legend art. And here's a Kiowa example legend art where depicting an event. Of course, this is a battle, but there were other events about the weather, different things that happened that ledger art was recording. And so there's different ways of looking at history, understanding history, and trying to maintain history. And now I want to talk a little bit about Indian policy, because I think that through all of this, tribal people have been subject to this huge system of the United States government and how that all works for and against tribal people and tribal governments and their status in the United States. The initial policy of the United States was that it would adopt the European policy. In order to become an independent country, independent of Britain, the United States had to agree in the Treaty of Versailles that it would adopt the principles that the European countries had in relation to native people. And one of those fundamental policies was that it had to treat those people in a fair way, and it couldn't take things away from them without their consent. And the United States agreed to do that, and so initially the United States entered into treaties with tribes as a form of getting their consent and a value of how the consent was obtained. At that time, the United States referred to Indian people as our red brother. And there actually was seats set aside in Congress for their red brother. There was ways that they tried to incorporate tribal people into the system. Then, as the military power of the United States grew, by about 1820, that changed. As the United States became more powerful, they used less and less the terms our red brother and more our terms of our red children. And that kind of policy and development continued. One of the things that the United States did under that policy was they removed tribal people. And the idea was to remove them west. And so Oklahoma became basically a place where mulatto tribes in the east were moved to, and it was called the removal period. And all of you have probably heard of the Cherokee Trail of Tears and the great removal and the tragedy that all was perpetuated upon them. By 1870, then the policy shifted from a removal. There was a period in the 1850s where they established reservations for tribes, and mainly because there was no place to move them anymore. The West, California was being colonized, the East was being colonized, and there was no place really to move tribes anymore. So they started to establish reservations, and that's where reservations became part of the United States system and tribal system. By the 70s, that reservation system became an assimilation system. So they broke the reservations up. They gave each person a tract of land and said, okay, now you have this land that you own as yours. Now, what they didn't say was they made those tracts fairly small, so there was a surplus in the reservation that they sold to non-Indians to pay for the creation of the smaller parts for the individual people. But that process of assimilation is now a very extraordinary, complicated system, because those people who got a tract of land back in 1870s, 1880s have died. They had children. Those children inherited that tract of land. They have died. Those had children. Those children have gotten the inheritance of that tract of land, and they have died. And there are now small tracts of land throughout the United States, some as small as 5 acres, that have 3,000 heirs to them because of that system that was developed and locked in. And it's very difficult to unwind that now. And there's a huge effort trying to figure out how to fix that system. But that was an assimilation system that was supposed to fix everything. It didn't work. Another thing the United States did in 1871 is it stopped making treaties with Indian tribes. It did that for a number of reasons. The main one was that it had basically acquired most of the land in the United States from Indian tribes, and it really didn't need a treaty system to do that. But a secondary issue was that if you buy something from a tribe or need to provide something to a tribe, you need to go through the House of Representatives, which authorizes the appropriation. And in the treaty-making process, the House of Representatives isn't involved. It's the Senate and the President. And so the House of Representatives wouldn't appropriate money that was agreed to under the treaties that the Senate ratified and the President signed. As a result, a lot of times you hear about things like broken treaties because things weren't implemented. And the reason they weren't implemented is because the House wanted something from the Senate or from the President, and the tribes got caught right in the middle of that system. And you can see that going on even in today's system. And the most amazing thing for me is that most of the stuff we see going on in the government, not dealing with tribes, but dealing with everybody, is the same thing that happened to tribes. They were all caught up in this. Healthcare things that we are dealing with in the government now, people are holding hostage because somebody wants something else, taxes, all those kinds of things. Tribes experienced all of that in a very microcosm of events. In the 1930s, then, the United States had a new policy towards Indian tribes called Reorganize Indian Tribes. They established that there would be a reorganization of Indian tribes and that a tribe could become a federal corporation, which was called a Section 17, or they could become an IRA tribe, which was a Section 16, and many tribes throughout the United States become an IRA tribe. Not retirement, but just a general Indian reorganization, which provided for the voting of tribal leaders through an election system very similar to elections of any place in the United States. Then in the 1950s, the United States flipped its policy of reorganizing tribes to termination of Indian tribes. So in the 1950s, as McCarthyism and all that was going rampant in the United States, there was also this huge move to terminate Indian tribes. And that meant just to take everything from them and end it. That didn't happen, thankfully. But there was a lot of impacts from that felt by tribes. Tribes lost land. Some tribes were actually terminated, particularly out in the state of Washington. And there was a huge effort to try to deal with all of that. Then in 1975, the policy shifted again, that Indian tribes would become self-determined. It was called the Self-Determined and Educational Act of 1975. So that tribes could be self-determined. What it really meant was services that the United States government agreed to provide to tribes through treaties. The tribes could actually contract that service through something called contractual relationship, an 8A contract with the United States government. These contracts sometimes were this thick, for maybe $10,000. They were unbelievable. They were basically a procurement contract with the United States government. The same way that the defense system procures things, different various government agencies procure things, tribes had the same thing. And so that was a system that was there. And then in 1994, the system changed again to something called self-governance. And that is the present federal policy that exists towards Indian tribes. And the tribal governments are self-governing in how they operate many of the functions that they do with the federal government. And so that's present policy. I don't know what future policies are going to look like, but that's kind of where we are. And if you're going to deal with Indian tribes, you really need to kind of understand all those so that you can actually function within that system. So thank you very much.
Yeah, it is because those early Europeans are not just learning about Native people, but they're really focusing on imposing Christianity onto Dakota people. And so in order to sort of participate in Christianity, it's critical for Christianity to have an understanding of what day is Sunday. And that is not important in Dakota thought originally. So we see the ways that we have invested in certain aspects of language and thought, and relationality is really important in Dakota thought. Dakota, the term, means friend or ally, and that belies sort of an orientation towards alliance. Today, certainly, we recognize that Dakota people, our numbers are small, even in our own homelands, and that having allies is critical to our survival. Once again, we don't have this like, I don't need anybody, I'm going to do it on my own. To me, that's like a soon-to-be dead Dakota person, because you really do need community for your survival. So similar to what Travis said, I think that is true. We do seek out commonalities. My experience with other Native people is the first thing we sort of spend time doing is try to figure out how we're related, and we always are related. So we figure out how we're related, what connections do we have, and it's those commonalities that relationships are built on. And of course, there's this overall understanding that being a part of a community in balance, all right, a balanced community, is key to our survival. Another one of those philosophical orientations, sort of our default, is this concept in Dakota of Mitakwe Owasi. They have a similar concept in Ojibwe, but it translates to all my relatives. And when we say that, Mitakwe Owasi is sort of in Dakota the shortest prayer you can offer. It's commonly said in prayer, but it is also said to sort of claim space for this philosophy. And so when we say all are my relatives, who are we referring to? Of course, you would expect that it would be other Dakota people, but really our understanding of relatives really includes land, certainly other humans, animals, plants, stars, rocks, and spirits. In fact, what I was taught was that it's everything that is seen and unseen. In fact, we give that sort of designation that we typically only apply to humans in a Western worldview. We give that designation to other aspects of creation as well. So a traditional teaching for Dakota people is that we come from the Wichachbi Oyate, the star nation. The star nation is its own nation. The plant nation is its own nation. It has its own sort of agency and interests, and that's a traditional teaching. Another one of our really important traditional teachings is Ikchewichashta. Ikchewichashta is the term that we today in modern times use as when we are talking about Native people in the aggregate. Prior to the development of race in the United States, which we did create, we created race. Prior to the way we've created race in the United States, we did not have a term for an aggregate of indigenous people because it wasn't needed. It wasn't a way we thought of things. But post sort of race, or post sort of the development of race, we now sort of in our language have to have a way of thinking about indigenous people, and we call those indigenous people Ikchewichashta. So when I introduced myself, I said, I teach Ikchewichashta studies, is what I said, because that's the way we understand Native studies. Ikchewichashta translates to common person or common man. And I think if we think in English, and this is an example of where that translation isn't very effective, that English doesn't really serve us. Because in Dakota, it translates to common person. In English, we really attach a lot of values to common. Common is in a hierarchy at the bottom. Common is everyday, common is banal. But in Dakota, we actually have to strive to become common. We have to work to become common. It's not a thing that you just get born. You have to become a common person. And it is that your efforts are to benefit the community. Another way of thinking about this is, how do we live into our greatest capacity as human beings, is another way to think about Ikchewichashta. But if we're thinking about being our best as a human being and sort of thinking about humanity, we also have to think about how have we been dehumanized and how have we dehumanized others. So some of that effort in becoming an Ikchewichashta is answering those questions about dehumanization. So if we were to sort of think about the ongoing impacts of land loss, which really is critical in sort of understanding it's important to understand sort of our philosophical orientations as we think about what it is like for Dakota people to live in a settler colonial society. So land loss has all kinds of effects on Native peoples, including it has an effect on those relationships. So as I explained, we have a relationship to everything in creation. When we are limited to our access to land and all the things that live on the land, those crucial connections that we have are impacted. Our traditional roles are disrupted. We have traditional teachings of how we are to interact with our relatives, and if we're not able to enact those roles, it impacts our who we are as people. It impacts our access to sacred places, our ability to practice our traditional ways, and then that would, of course, include food ways, which impacts our health and the health of the land, impacts healing. Their resources used in traditional practices, all of these are impacted with land loss. The language that's related to place. So we have, if you're not able to visit a place, the stories that you tell of that place and the Dakota words that you use to describe that place, those can get forgotten or lost if we're not able to visit those places. And then, of course, Native economy. So I talk to my students about the ways that colonial practices sort of undermine and attack and threaten indigenous institutions. So we have all the same institutions that we might note. We have a justice system, we have an education system, we have healthcare, we have all these institutions, but colonialism has sort of undermined all of that. And one of those especially impacted is Native economies. Now, I want to get to this because my thinking about the questions that we've had about assimilation is sort of really looking to the individual, or looking to Native people as the changes that they've made. And I want us to flip that and think more about the ways that colonial systems have erased Dakota experience. So the experiences and realities of Native people are generally absent. If you were to talk to average people in Minnesota Makoche, you were to ask them about what do they know about the indigenous people of the lands on whom they live and benefit from daily. They have a very sort of fuzzy understanding of who those individuals are and what the story is of that place. At most, Native people are sort of within some kind of story that's very short, and it's a colonial narrative. It is, there were Indians, they're gone now, and so now this is all ours. And I think that's the colonial narrative, and in that way, Native people, if at all we fit in the story, it's of the past and not of now. Generally, I think the public consciousness is that Native people kind of have a sad story, but the specifics of that are not known. And because Minnesotans and because people in this region have such a limited understanding of Native experience and Dakota experience, it's much easier to ignore, forget, minimize, and erase Dakota experience. So some of my initiatives, many of my initiatives have been in the sphere of education. I'm a teacher, but I've also been working on other educational projects. I'm looking at Minnesota as where are we at in terms of educational opportunities and educational achievement for Dakota people and other Native people. And so we typically look at the graduation rates, and that is the adjusted cohort graduation rate is sort of the measure. In 2010, 2011, Native students was the worst in the nation. In Minnesota, and some of you are probably from Minnesota and some of you aren't, but we have this understanding, we have this belief that Minnesota has a really quality education system. And we do, for some people. It is not the same quality for everyone. So in 2010, 2011, Native students are graduating from high school at a rate of 42%. And for comparison, in the same year, white students were graduating at a rate of 84%. So we see tremendous disparities. And if we were to sort of look and see that measurement over time, we have only had slight improvements. And in 2016, 2017, which is where we have the most recent data, Native students are graduating at a rate of 51% and white students graduating at 88%. So we still see that those disparities have not changed. And I would really look to what have we been doing and is it effective? So we know that most Native students in Minnesota attend public schools. By far, it's like 97%, 98% attend public schools. In the past, and I would say this is since the 1500s, when in the United States we had the very first mission schools, early 1500s, the efforts at addressing the educational achievement of Native people have really been it's been the same for hundreds of years. And that is, Native people need to do better, Native families need to change in order to do better in educational settings. Some of those have been successful in different ways. We have greater tribal control over curriculum funding, which has been a benefit. There is, in my observation, a greater understanding among educators of their recognition of privileges and disadvantages, and that's been a positive. But still, the arguments about why we need to do better really focus on socioeconomic status, race and ethnicity, and school funding inequities. So this is kind of what we've been doing since 1500. I want to point out that there is a hegemonic sort of foundational understanding that the assimilationist model is the only model. It's the only model we've really seriously tried in mainstream education systems in the United States. So in order to do better, Native students, Native families, and Native communities need to change. That's been the model. Rather, I argue that it's the positioning and the disconsciousness. And when I say disconsciousness, we have an understanding of what our subconscious and our unconscious. Disconsciousness, in the way that I'm using it, is the way that it is something that we're aware of, but we choose not to know. We choose not to be aware of. We set it aside. So it is the positioning and disconsciousness of non-natives that continues to enforce repressive systems in educational settings. The ignorance of Native experience is tied. It's not accidental. It's not about just forgetting. It is tied to colonial systems and settler privilege. And this positioning, this disconsciousness, contributes directly to the erasure of Indigenous people. So this is not so much about Indigenous people assimilating, more than the way that systems are erasing Dakota experience. This has been inscribed in curricula and enacted in pedagogy. We see this in these forms. So what I have been working on is developing an educational intervention that is, while it benefits Native people, it's really for everybody else. The intervention is a curriculum called Minnesota Makoche, the Dakota Homelands. It's taught in 6th grade. In Minnesota, it's when you learn 6th grade social studies. 6th grade social studies is when you learn about the state history of Minnesota. So the idea of this curriculum is that we're going to center Dakota experiences and voices in this curriculum. We're going to assert Minnesota Makoche as a Dakota place. We're going to portray the history of Minnesota Makoche as a shared history. It's not just Dakota people's history, it's all of our histories. If you're living in Minnesota, you are now part of the story of Minnesota, or Minnesota Makoche. Although the stories are not, the experience is not the same. And it would address the invisibility that many students face and it would be taught throughout the region. So this is an initiative that I've been working on for about 7 years. We highlight community voices. We use Dakota pedagogy, like we cho oyake, or these teaching stories. It's based on a prior oral history project. We understand that storytelling is a pedagogical tool. We think about sense of belonging, and when I think of sense of belonging, there's lots of research that talks about sense of belonging is very much tied to student success, but we're thinking about sense of belonging in terms of sense of belonging to the land. We encourage students, so all the students in this space, to see themselves as part of this story. Both Indigenous and settler are sort of part of this broader story. And it provides a lens or a window for students to consider historical and contemporary Native experience. So this is a lens that non-Native students can sort of try. It's like if we talk about the philosophical orientations, that they can sort of, how would I imagine the 1805 treaty? How would I imagine being part and the impacts of the 1805 treaty, both in 1805 and in 2019, as a Dakota person? How might it's that potential for sort of empathy. So the curriculum has lots of traditional teachings and concepts and orientations. That's sort of foundational. Those are some of the things that I've talked with you already about today. This is not widely accessible outside of Dakota communities, so this would be a first time that this is available in this sort of form for broader communities. So in the end, it is sort of what I'm looking for is sort of a paradigm shift among non-Native people. At the foundation of these inequities is really the disconsciousness of settlers and settler-oriented institutions. That's what I'm arguing. Initiatives that focus on assimilating will have the same effects that they've had since 1500. We need to educate to facilitate the shifting of paradigms of non-natives, and that requires working on strained relationships. We believe and we see actually in the research that Indigenous pedagogies are meaningful for lots of students. The traditional system doesn't work for lots of students. And in many respects, when we have taught this curriculum, we have anecdotal and research data that's really talking about the ways that many sixth graders in Minnesota have connected with this in a way that they haven't with other social studies lessons. And in the end, what we're kind of thinking about, this is plotting essentially for a future, thinking about what are the long-term impacts of a citizenry who has both a healthy relationship to the land and a healthy understanding, a sort of an understanding of a full story of that place. So that's sort of the end result is sort of what kinds of shifts will we see in our citizenry if we make these shifts in sixth grade. So that's what I wanted to say. That's it. Thank you very much.
I'll invite the panelists to come sit up here at the table, and we have a little over 10 minutes for questions and answers. There is a microphone right here, so please come on up.
Hi there. I, of course, want to first say that I really appreciate all of you guys coming and taking time out of your day and schedule to prepare a presentation like this and show it to us. My question is specifically for Darlene St. Clair, and I was curious, over time, as you've been working in education, especially on this one program for over 7 years, then what have you seen, how have you seen shifts in education that have been positive, like what has worked, and then what have maybe either you or some of your colleagues tried that has not been effective?
So we're still analyzing the data. So we had a research cohort worth over 3 years. We had the curriculum being implemented in classrooms, and then we did pre and post surveys and pre and post focus groups with students to sort of try to measure what were the impacts. So we're still analyzing the qualitative data. But anecdotally, what I can say is just from talking with teachers who have implemented the curriculum, I think that when the right amount of energy and time is put into it, it has like a substantial impact in the classroom environment. So there was a school whose teacher really invested in the curriculum, and she saw students, their dynamics in the classroom change beyond sort of the social studies time. So she saw there was a student who was really kind of disengaged, and he decided to develop an after-school club called the No Judgment Club, which he said was sort of an influence or inspired by this lesson on Ikche Wichashta about dehumanizing and living into your true humanity. And she's like, this is a kid who didn't ever get involved in anything, and he wanted to start this club. Another example in that same classroom was, I think this is not a classroom with Native students. These are all non-Native students, but a diverse classroom. Someone in the class saying something about immigration, and another student saying, I found what you said to be dehumanizing. This is like sixth graders. So, I mean, I think that the ways that they're sort of trying out these concepts, not just in like it's a thing for social studies, but it impacted their kind of classroom dynamics. So those are some of the anecdotes. What we're seeing as we're evaluating the data, especially the qualitative data, is really rich. I'm finding the quantitative data sort of says some things, but the qualitative data, even though it was very difficult to come by and very expensive, it's really impactful. I think one of the things that's coming out of it is it does say some things about the curriculum and about what was successful and what sort of missed students. One of the things it's not telling us, though, is it missed because of the curriculum or the way the teachers taught it. One of the things that we are noticing is that some of these concepts are uncomfortable for teachers to teach as well. And so getting to a place where growing teacher capacity will have a big impact on whether it's successful or not. And the other thing that's coming out of the curriculum is because the focus groups were done in, there was a Native group, a white group, and a people of color, student of color group. And so in order to like allow for certain conversations to happen that might not happen in other ways. And especially the student of color group really did use that as an opportunity to talk, like a rare opportunity for them to talk about their experiences being a student of color. And so one of the things that's coming out of the curriculum that was not an intended consequence, but we're learning a lot about kind of the ways that race is already cemented in kids' minds, and especially something we commonly see in the white student groups is like coming in sort of fairly defensive and saying, oh, we treat everyone the same and we're equal here. And it's that kind of rhetoric that we see in larger society among adults. It's already really entrenched in sixth grade. So we're learning a lot about the way kids think about and talk about race in sixth grade. And that's not a part of what we thought we were going to do, but I also teach about race, and so I'm very interested in that as well. I think for the curriculum, the teacher capacity is a really big thing. Most people did not learn about Native peoples in their K-12 experience. Most teacher preparation programs have done not a very good job at teaching teachers to teach about Native people. And so we're really asking a lot of teachers to teach about something that they really feel like they don't have internal capacity, and they themselves don't even feel strong in their understanding. So I would say something I really see as a place to grow is developing more support for teachers. I'm not mad at them. This is really sort of the world that we live in, and but I want to make that change because, of course, the paradigm shift is what I'm going towards. And I often will say when I talk to groups of adults, I'm like, I love you 40-year-olds, but it's like sixth graders is where I'm investing my energy. I really think the sixth graders are going to have the capacity. It's like if we do see a shift so that this is commonly taught and a common understanding and something that students get at that time period in their lives, sixth grade is really when you're also thinking about justice and like fairness. And so it really does make sense to be taught at that level. And then you think about what public policy will come out of a Minnesota that has this understanding. That's what I'm aiming for.
Questions?
I'll just use my teacher voice. My question is for Don. With this history of federal Indian policy, I've studied this before, but I'm not that knowledgeable. Has there been a time in U.S. history where federal Indian policy has been changed through dialogue with the tribes? Or is it always through whatever's going on in federal politics?
There's basically 2 points where that may have occurred. The first point was when the original treaties were negotiated, tribes had much more military power. They also, what I always think is amazing is those tribal leaders developed a process that are still valid today. So if we all sit down today and write something that 150 years from now is still going to be valid, I'd say good luck to us, because we'd have a heck of a time doing that. But they were able to do that. And I, worked on treaty rights for a long time. And so there's still that, really amazing thing that those tribal leaders were able to draft documents that are still valid 100, 170 years later. The real discussion about where there was actually interaction between tribal governments and the United States was under self-governance. I don't know how many of you remember, but in 1987, that was the 200th anniversary of the signing of the Constitution of the United States. And Roger Jourdain, the chairman of Red Lake, and Wendell Chino, the chairman of Muscalero Apache, had 2 issues. One was Reagan stood for, I think, 3 or 4 hours and talked on national TV about the fixing of the Statue of Liberty and the immigrants that came to the United States. And not once did he mention Native people in that whole 3 hours of discussion. And that made those 2 tribal leaders extraordinarily upset and said that in the signing of the Constitution, that it would not go by without tribal input into that process. And so 2 things that they wanted. One was that they wanted that there would be recognition of tribes in the signing of the Constitution. And the second was that there was a better way of dealing with tribes, in particular something called preliminary power. Preliminary power is that the Congress has the right to do whatever it wants to Indian tribes. Tribes don't believe that's true. And Milner Ball, for those really interested, wrote an article about that. He was a legal scholar, constitutional scholar, about that authority. And the second one was, there was presented at Philadelphia, tribal leaders presented papers on tribal sovereignty and the development of tribal sovereignty. Congress said, okay, we hear you, and we're going to ask you 10 tribes that were involved in the initial process, develop something that we haven't developed that you think will work better than what's presently going on, and that was self-governance.
You may have like 1 minute or 2, if anyone, one final question? Thank you.
One part of our peace studies is kind of concerned with the war system and the effects of war, and I'm just curious, serving in war can create moral injury for anyone, and so I think each of you could have something to say, or just wondering, is there anything particular for Native Americans that we ought to know about in terms of returning service members, the types of moral injuries that might be suffered, they may suffer that might be similar or different to others, just the difficulty in returning home after service?
Well, fortunately, I never had to serve in any conflict or serve in war, but I know that I've done a lot of research and done a lot of study on Native veterans. Actually, that's how I got to know Darlene. Was we brought a exhibit into the History Center when I first started working for the Historic Society called Native Words and Native Warriors, and it was all about the code talkers that served in the United States Army and basically helped win World War II. Darlene's great uncle was Dakota code talker, and so that's how we met. But I know that what a lot of tribes have done, and it goes back to, besides them being in the United States military, was you had ceremonies and you had ways to send off soldiers and warriors. And then you also had ways to bring them back into the communities. So there was certain specific ceremonies that were done to bring them back. And they're still done today. And it's ceremonies that, focus on trying to get rid of the grief, get rid of, some of the pain and anguish and the things that war brings to people. And so there is a way to do that. And so many times in our our service men and women come home and there is nothing like that for them. And that's why today, you look at our homeless population, like 40% of the homeless population in the United States is veterans. And that's because they've never really dealt with it. So they're coming back with not just physical injuries, but they're coming out back with mental health issues that they're not dealing with, that no one sat down and helped them deal with and come to terms with. And it causes a lot of issues.